Well, hello, everyone. My name is Rodney Sobin with NASEO, National Association of State Energy Officials. We welcome you to today's webinar on data center and large load flexibility to meet energy demand growth. This webinar is offered jointly under the NASEO-NARUC Grid Interactive Efficient Buildings Working Group and under NASEO's Powering Up Data Centers webinar series. Before introducing our panel, I'll tell you a little bit about NASEO and then a little bit about housekeeping. Next slide, please, Camille. So NASEO, for those unfamiliar, we are the association of the 56 state and territory energy offices, and we serve as a resource for the state energy offices through various committees, dialogues, these sorts of events, and other sorts of resources. And I also take a moment to apologize that I don't have a parallel slide for our NARUC, National Association of Regulatory Utility Commissioners, our good friends and partners there with whom we collaborate not only on the NASEO-NARUC Grid Interactive Efficient Buildings Working Group, but on multiple other topics, including demand flexibility, DERs, grid edge, virtual power plants, and so on. We also work on nuclear and quite a few other topics. Next slide, please. A little bit about housekeeping. The webinar is being recorded, and we will post the slides in the recording with links on the GEB Working Group webpage, as well as the NASEO Energy Load pages. You are muted, and when it is time to ask a question, which we hope you will do, please use the Q&A box. Next slide. A little on the agenda, we are very pleased to host today Blaise Caudill, the Energy Policy Advisor to Arizona's Governor Katie Hobbs, and Deputy Director of the Office of Resiliency in the Executive Office of the Governor, i.e. the State Energy Office. Thank you, member, for joining us. He will moderate presentations and discussions with Tyler Norris, the James B. Duke Fellow at the Nicholas Institute of Energy, Environment, and Sustainability at Duke University, and also a PhD student, on the potential for integration of large flexible loads in the U.S. power system, which probably many of you have seen reference to recently. And then Arun Vijayekar, sorry if I mispronounce, Senior Vice President, Strategy and Commercial at Emerald AI, who will report on some exciting recent demonstrations they've done in the Phoenix, Arizona area on actual data center flexibility, something a lot of us have talked about, but he has real data. So with that, let me hand it over to Blaise to lead us on. Thank you.
Yes, good morning, everyone, and thank you so much to NASEO as well as NARUC for inviting us to moderate this morning. We're very, very excited as the state of Arizona to be able to moderate such an important conversation like this. And I want to thank everyone for joining today. As we know, data centers are very much a hot topic right now, and we're very much eager and excited to hear more from our panelists this morning. So just a quick introduction to the Office of Resiliency. So the Office of Resiliency was established by the governor when she was first inaugurated just a few years ago. And we serve as the state energy office as well as the policy advising house for the governor as it relates to natural resources, including energy, water, transportation, and land use. I have the pleasure of serving as the governor's energy policy advisor, and it has truly been the most incredible journey and honor and privilege to serve in this capacity. I'm very much really looking forward to hearing from our panelists for what I know is going to be a very good dive into how states can continue to meet such large load growth with new technologies and approaches. Arizona is definitely no stranger to data centers. We rank in the top 5 states in the country for data center attraction and location. Currently, we estimate that about 7.4% of Arizona's energy demand is driven by existing data centers. And given the importance of data centers and Arizona's larger focus on semiconductor manufacturing, Governor Hobbs has been deeply engaged in the conversations around how we responsibly continue to grow, while also taking into account and being very mindful of our natural resources and being a good steward to our natural resources. We've seen local governments in Arizona take action around data centers, but we also understand that there's a need for a larger statewide conversation and approach. And we're really looking forward to continuing those discussions and conversations with industry, with our local utility partners, and with consumer protections representatives. With all that in mind, I definitely know that a lot of the tools and opportunities that we hear about today will be absolutely critical to those conversations and the work that we're able to do to advance data centers, as well as being mindful again of our natural resources. So with that, I want to actually pass the floor over to Tyler Norris for his presentation.
Thanks so much. Let me pull this up here. Can you see that okay?
Looking good.
Great. Thank you so much for having me, and to NASEO and NARUC and your teams for organizing this important conversation. I'm honored to have the opportunity to present our collective research to you today. And just a little bit of background on who we are. So this research was a collaboration between the Nicholas Institute at Duke, which is sort of a think tank bolted on to the university, and with our school, the Nicholas School, where our lab is based, and our lab is called Grace Lab, that is risk aware for clean electricity. And our research primarily focuses on bulk electric power systems and modeling. And I apologize for this errant text box at the bottom that says close. That's not part of the presentation. So the goals for this report, which is called Rethinking Load Growth, and I can't believe it was 6 months ago now, so it came out in February, was actually substantially oriented towards audiences like this one to help regulators and stakeholders and market participants in identifying ways to accommodate all this load growth without compromising, critically reliability, affordability, or to the extent that it's possible, progress on decarbonization, to provide what we want to characterize as a first order estimate of the potential for accommodating new loads while mitigating or deferring the need for bulk capacity expansion. And importantly, to motivate additional research and analysis on the part of a variety of different entities to more precisely characterize the available headroom on each balancing authority in the US. And so we are proceeding to do some of that modeling work ourselves in collaboration with other universities and external parties as well, as part of a larger initiative. And we've been delighted to see that other researchers are now doing the same. A very interesting paper actually worked and BER came out last week from a team at MIT, and the IEA has done some similar analysis, and there's more to come. So we're delighted to see that. And before digging in, I just wanted to acknowledge that we were significantly inspired by the Department of Energy, Secretary of Energy Advisory Board recommendations that were released last July, which identified the opportunity and the need for more research on large load flexibility, and especially for data centers. And then, of course, EPRI's DC Flex initiative launched towards the end of last year. And so those efforts helped to inspire this work. I will say we've given of this presentation, but there is new content, I promise. So even if you've seen a version of this, I think there'll be a few additional slides and information that will be valuable. So backdrop, I think we are all very well aware at this point, but just to state it in as clear terms as possible, that AI specialized data centers are now expected to be one of the single largest drivers of US electricity load growth over the next 5 to 7 years. There are a lot of different forecasts out there. It's hard to keep track of them all. But one of the upper end forecasts that we've seen suggests that data centers could account for up to 44% of US electricity load growth through 2028. That AI workloads specifically could represent between 50 to 70% of all US data center demand by 2030. And that most of that is driven by hyperscale and large-scale colocation data centers. And of course, Lawrence Berkeley National Labs Data Center Energy Usage Report that came out in December 2024 was very helpful in characterizing this. And that was a congressionally mandated report. And so you can see here how the AI specialized load growth is really driving that future scenario range that they present going out to 2028. Of course, there is significant uncertainty, and nothing highlighted that more than the release of DeepSeek in January, although it does appear that I think the leading forecasters are still predicting somewhere in this range. You can also see this in terms of the breakdown of hyperscale versus co-location, large-scale facilities. I think this was a relatively rough assumption on their team's part, but it does give a sense of how this will be composed by the space type. The other aspect of this, which I think most of us are well aware of at this point, is that this shift towards more AI specialized workloads does enable siting in more remote locations than what traditionally occurred with the very, very high concentration in Northern Virginia because of the shift in latency requirements. And so that is part of what's driving this geographic diversification of siting, which creates challenges, but also opportunities for those regions, and does create interesting opportunities for more co-location, in some cases with a more diverse set of on-site generation options. All of this is colliding, of course, with supply side constraints. And so we've seen this pop up in a variety of areas with transformer order lead times have grown, to 2 to 5 years. There was a very helpful report from the National Infrastructure Council on that in 2024. Similar effect on lead times for high voltage circuit breakers. And then all of that aggregating to longer interconnection wait times for these loads. And of course, the most extreme version of that that's been documented is delays of up to 7 to 10 years. Of course, the average is nowhere near that high, but that is some of the impact that's being seen. And of course, there's been a lot of discussion and coverage on the constraint around gas turbines, also a lot of healthy debate. I think initially the level of constraint there may have been overstated, and it does seem like there is movement on GE Vernova's part to supply more, but it is of course one of the key constraints here. And Brattle put out, I think, just a simplified, helpful chart to sort of think about this, which is I think quite an upper end forecast of what the growth in peak U.S. demand could look like out to 2030. It does, at least based on what I've seen and what Brattle has observed, that there's a general consensus that the constraint on gas turbines in this time range would be somewhere between 60 to 80 gigawatts. That's also what NextEra's CEO is quoted, and what Brattle's seeing. So you can see that leaves this gap. If we were to expect peak growth of that scale, there is a gap that has to be met by other resources, and that is part of the opportunity for demand side resources and flexibility to contribute. And so the good news in all of this is that we, of course, plan our electric power systems based on the most extreme swings in demand during polar vortexes in the winter or extreme summer heat waves. And outside of those limited number of hours, there is headroom on the system. And so there are different ways to kind of visualize and quantify this. This is our sort of classic load duration curve covering all of the US ISO RTOs based on their hourly load data between 2016 to 2024. This is the chart actually that Constellation adapted to put into their their quarterly earnings report in May. So actually they added the commentary on the specific numbers here on the chart. But as you can see, about 98% of the time, more than 10% of the power system is unused. Or you can say 95% of the time, about 20% or more of the power system is unused, and 80%, over a third, is unused. You can also look at this in terms of more than 10% of the system is built to serve approximately, on average, 35 hours a year of extreme peak load. This varies across jurisdiction. These are the 22 balancing authorities that we looked at. And the average load factor, meaning the average load over the peak load that's actually been realized in these jurisdictions over this 9-year period, averaged to 53%. That varies, of course, on the summer and the winter. Generally, it's materially higher in those peak months. And if you zoomed in even further on, the most extreme week or multi-day period, it would be higher. But this gives a sense of the annualized version. And so another way of stating is that on average, in any given hour, half of the system sits unused. You can also think about this in terms of the utilization or the capacity factor of the U.S. natural gas combined cycle fleet. And that capacity factor has grown over time as combined cycle units have become more efficient, but nevertheless, we're still on average below 60%. And so there is, in terms of energy, substantial untapped resource there, about 40% of our installed combined cycle natural gas fleet. And so when we think about this in the context of new load that's coming on the system, we can just kind of think of this simplified spectrum where on one end of that spectrum, to the extent that a new load is entirely inflexible, that means it's likely to put more burden on those existing system peaks, which means it's more likely on average to trigger the need for additional generation and transmission capacity and, of course, reserve margin. And therefore, it's more likely to require longer interconnection timelines. Whereas on the other end of that spectrum, to the extent that a load is flexible, but less burden at existing system peak, less likely to trigger the need for bulk system upgrades, and therefore has the potential to be interconnected to the system more quickly. In terms of the types of load flexibility, these are sort of the general buckets that we've found it helpful to categorize them into. And so the first and foremost, which has been the primary source of flexibility to date, is on-site power and storage. And I think it's no secret that there's a general preference on the part of the data center industry to select this source of flexibility to minimize any potential impact on uptime. Nevertheless, there is the opportunity for temporal flexibility to shift around workloads, and of course, Emerald AI and Arun will talk more of that. I'm excited to hear those results. There's developing interest from some of the most sophisticated hyperscalers on the ability to do spatial flexibility, so to actually shift workloads around to different data centers and regions that may not be experiencing the same contingency event. And then, of course, there is the option for reduced operations, not especially appealing to data centers, although I think it is worth, for example, considering on an extremely cold winter morning during a polar vortex, there may not be the need for as much load that is on peak for that, say, 2 to 3 hours when the highest loss of load expectation occurs in some jurisdictions, right between 6 and 9 a.m. So there could be an opportunity to plan around that reduction in operations, at least from a cooling load perspective. I found it helpful to talk about data center uptime because I think we've all encountered this in this space, that there is a perception among sophisticated parties too that these facilities are running very, very close to their maximum potential capacity most of the time. And this gets expressed in different ways, but oftentimes it's stated something along the lines of these are 24/7, 365, near 100% load factor loads. And these are just a few slides. This isn't to pick on anyone. It's just a few examples of the way this has been represented, I think, to regulators and other stakeholders. And I think it is helpful to parse some of this out because there is some confusion, at least I've seen here. And so one point I think that's helpful to clarify is that, of course, load factor is not utilization rate, or more properly, capacity utilization rate. So if we recall, load factor is a load's average load over its actual peak realized load. And so you may have a situation where the customer's peak load is actually, say, only 85% of its rated capacity. It could still have a high load factor, 90%. In that case, its capacity utilization rate would be 77%. The other thing to remember is that when we say load factor, that doesn't necessarily refer to server uptime. And so let's make sure we're sort of distinguishing load factor for the overall facility versus the uptime for the servers themselves. The other point that's helpful to clarify I have found is that server uptime is not 5 nines, right? So the servers are not being operated to 99.999% of their maximum rating. In fact, I don't know that it's even theoretically possible to achieve that level of utilization. You have to have extremely efficient code to do so. So the 5 nines is a customer-facing guarantee. It is not a representation of the utilization rate of the servers. The other thing that I already alluded to is that there is substantial variance in the non-IT load. And more generally, as we all know, the data is extremely limited. And that applies even in the case of a congressionally mandated report by a leading national laboratory. So there's not a lot to work with here. And so I just put this out there, and I won't go through all these definitions. This is more just for everyone's reference, but I have found it helpful just for purposes of clarification to sort of parse out the power system planning terminology here from the data center and compute terminology. And it's worth recognizing that this metric that has become predominant in the data center industry, which is helpful from a certain perspective, power usage effectiveness, just good to acknowledge that that does not tell us anything about the actual capacity utilization rate of the facilities. And so if you are a regulator, like or on the staff of a utility commission, as some on this webinar are today, and you are told by your regulated utility that they are expecting a certain number of gigawatts of AI data centers in your jurisdiction, there's sort of a puzzle of how do you actually translate that into how many average megawatt hours in a given year you would expect. And it's very hard to come up with a metric, again, because of the lack of data. So LBNL selected 50%. We've seen other studies suggest as high as 75 to 80%. Other studies, actually by the Netherlands in this case, they just said it's unknown. You can see on the right-hand side, this is what LBNL represented in their data center energy usage report. And you can see the very significant variation there. And so at least based on the best currently available public information, I think the average figure that we can point to is in the realm of 50%, unless it's a very, very heavy training-oriented data center. And so hopefully that's helpful. And I'm always hopeful that we will get access to more data so that we can better characterize this for regulators and other stakeholders. So just shifting gears and kind of to sum up this background section, when we think about the potential values of flexibility, the first and of course of greatest interest for the large loads is faster speed to power. And so to the extent that they can get online more quickly while offering curtailment during that limited number of hours a year, whether it's 50 to 100 hours or a bit more in some jurisdictions. That could allow them to, number two here, to actually access the more interconnection capacity and more hours of the year. And the traditional planning approach here is that you limit any new load to whatever your periods of highest system stress can accommodate. But under a flexible planning paradigm, that load would be able to access that additional interconnection capacity outside those hours. Third value stream, to the extent that there are mandates, which we've obviously seen in Texas with SB 6, at least for emergency service, and others that may be emerging in other jurisdictions. And then fourth, even though I think we recognize that existing demand response revenues are not necessarily enough to motivate significant amounts of flexibility with the current increase in capacity market prices in a variety of jurisdictions. It could be that moves the needle for some loads, or at least just adds to this sort of layering of incentives. Okay, so now to just shift gears into the analysis, and I'll go through this relatively quickly. The basic method is we took the maximum realized peak from each of the 22 balancing authorities over the 9-year period. So this is just for illustrative purposes to show you. In BJM, we took that on a seasonal basis, so the highest realized peak in the summer and the winter for each jurisdiction. We then added incremental new load into each balancing authority, assuming that the new load was constant, simply because the data centers vary a lot, so we don't have a more specific sort of load curve to assume. So assuming that the new load is constant, which is a relatively sort of conservative assumption, we would look at the hours in which those existing realized peaks, which the operators are already planning to be able to serve, and we count any load in excess of that existing realized peak as curtailed energy. And then we aggregate that for each of these jurisdictions, assuming a certain amount of flexibility on the part of the new load, of course, not to the existing load, so only curtailment from the new load. And we find that if the new load is willing to be curtailed for 0.5% maximum potential annual uptime, that these would be the results in each of these jurisdictions from a resource adequacy perspective. So how much new load could each jurisdiction accommodate given this amount of annualized load curtailment, such that it would not exceed the existing seasonal peaks that the jurisdictions have already planned to accommodate. And we also looked at that at 0.25% new load curtailment, which aggregated to approximately 76 gigawatts of headroom across the 22 balancing authorities. And you can also sort of look at this in terms of, as you add incremental amounts of new load to each balancing authority, how does the necessary annualized curtailment rate change? And there's a version of this plot for each of the balancing authorities and an appendix to the report. And you can also think about this in terms of the number of hours in which curtailment would be required for the new load. And so if we zoom in here in the bottom left of this chart at the 0.25% curtailment limit for the new load, we find that on average, in 85 hours of the year, some amount of curtailment would be necessary. But in 73 of those 85 hours, at least 50% of that new load is retained. So what we're generally talking about is partial curtailment, such that in most hours, most of that load is retained. Just thought it's worth noting a couple other recent modeling efforts. So the IEA took a kind of simplified approach to replicating the method, looking at a few other jurisdictions. So you can see their numbers here at relatively similar levels of load flexibility. There were some differences in their method that probably explain the variance in results, but generally in a similar ballpark. And then this is just a very illustrative modeling exercise that our team recently ran with our own unit commitment and economic dispatch model developed with ARPA-E sponsorship applied to Duke Energy Carolinas and Duke Energy Progress, which has a combined system peak of about 37 gigawatts, looking at the load and weather year specifically of 2022 with an hourly resolution, modeling the system's existing load, and then adding 4.1 gigawatts of additional load in one scenario, and then 8 gigawatts of additional load in another scenario. And the results actually were surprising to us. It actually identified that there is more potential headroom, again, this is not layer in transmission constraints, but from a resource adequacy standpoint, there's actually more headroom identified than in our analysis for the report in February. And I won't go into too much details here on the guts of why that might be the case, but what we actually found was that in adding 4.1 gigawatts of new load, there was near zero curtailment required, and adding 8 gigawatts of new load translated to, and just for calibration, what we had found was that 4.1 gigawatts would be able to be accommodated at 0.25% curtailment. That's what we found in the February analysis. But this actually suggested that there'd be near zero at 4.1 gigawatts. This is just taking peak weeks during the summer and showing what the dispatch results would be. As would be expected, there is more dispatch of the peaker units to accommodate that new load. But based on, at least in this case, the operational reserve requirement of these balancing authorities, it would be able to be accommodated. So this is just for illustrative purposes. We're doing more modeling, but more to come on that front. And finally, to wrap us out, I know we're getting towards time here. I've just found it helpful to keep track of some of the latest developments. And so there's a kind of flurry of activity happening. I was recently in Albany with the New York ISO team and was alerted to the fact that they, in their recent reliability needs assessment, did assume that a certain portion of their large load forecast would be flexible based on their characteristics. In that case, it was more for hydrogen production facilities and crypto mines. But it was one of the few examples I've come across where planners at system operator level are actually assuming a certain amount of load flexibility. We've seen some interesting state legislation be proposed that would create incentives for large flexible loads, and this is just one example in New Jersey. The governor of Massachusetts proposed a bill in mid-May that would require the regulated utilities to create flexible interconnection programs. So we'll see where that goes. We saw the Pennsylvania Office of Consumer Advocate come out in comments to their Public Utility Commission suggesting that there should be tariffs available for large flexible loads. And one of the few cases of a center owner operator stating that they have committed to load flexibility, Beacon AI, which is apparently developing 3 to 4 gigawatts of data centers in Alberta, stated that they have reached agreement with the Alberta Electric System Operator to shift to on-site power during periods of system stress. So we haven't, of course, seen that contract, but this is as represented by the CEO of Beacon Power. I think at this point, everyone's aware of Texas enacting SB 6, which would require mandatory curtailment from large loads defined as those above 75 megawatts and would create a voluntary demand response procurement program. In SPP, they have now proposed these new non-firm transmission service tier, which they've called CHILLS, as well as a streamlined interconnection study method for loads that are co-located with generation. And so I know that's still working its way through SPP's internal process. I was informed yesterday that it appears perhaps they've reached agreement on some modifications that will allow that to proceed. So we will see where that goes once they file it with FERC. Of course, the PJM co-location docket is now sitting and awaiting a FERC order, which I hear is likely imminent. So we'll see where that comes out. But for those that haven't followed it very closely, these are the 5 additional transmission service tiers that PJM proposed in response to the expressed interest in the opportunity for more flexible loads that may be co-located with generation or that bring other flexible capabilities. So it's interesting to see some of this innovation happening in transmission service design, and we will see where that lands in PJM. This is, I thought, an interesting, there's too much text here, so I won't go, but it's interesting to see some of the debate around the barriers to uptake for flexible loads based on the existing default design of interconnection and transmission service. And then this week, Google with a significant announcement that they have executed long-term definitive contracts with Indiana Michigan Power and with Tennessee Valley Authority that will allow those utilities to plan around that curtailability for resource adequacy purposes. And at least from what we're aware of, it being one of the first of its kind agreement, at least with a U.S. utility, where an AI specialized data center has committed to curtailment for the purposes of longer term resource adequacy planning. And so that's it. I'll stop there and look forward to discussion. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much, Tyler. That was really fascinating. I'm not gonna lie, I'm kind of a nerd and I love charts. So seeing all the charts was just absolutely great. Really, really appreciate your presentation and the information. And I know this was dropped into the chat, but just wanted to remind everyone, as you have questions, please feel free to add those to the chat box, and we will definitely be monitoring the chats as they come in for a full Q&A later in the program. So for now, I would like to turn the floor over to Arun with Emerald AI.
Awesome. Great. Can you hear me all right, please?
That's perfect, yes.
Great. And thank you, Swasti, for pulling up our slides. So nice to meet everyone here. Thank you for the great interest in this. It's fantastic to see over 100 attendees here. Quick introduction. My name is Arun Vijayekar. I'm the SVP of Strategy and Commercial here at Emerald AI. So I lead the commercial side of the house, surrounded by a fantastic team of PhDs and experts in their technical field. So, feel blessed to be on this team. And thank you, Rod, and the NASEO team, as well as the NARUC team, for having us here to speak a little bit about what Emerald AI is doing. We're an early stage AI startup, and one of, obviously, a number of startups working on the data center flexibility challenge. We obviously like to think we have an interesting and unique competitively advantaged approach to solving this challenge, and excited to take you all through that today. Can we go into our slides then? Awesome. So we'll just cover 4 topics today. We'll talk a little bit about who we are, what our technology is all about, do a deep dive on the results of our first commercial demonstration back in May, and then talk a little bit about where we go from here. So at a high level, we are here to solve the problem of time to power for data centers. I think a lot of what is the framing context for my presentation is stuff that Tyler's already touched on, so I'll try to speed through it. But at a high level, we are orchestrating compute flexibility for data centers in order to deliver the load flexibility that we've been talking about here and that is so valuable. So there's a bunch of other folks working on flexibility through on-site generation and batteries, usually CapEx intensive solutions. Our approach is a purely software-driven approach that is intended to orchestrate the actual workloads running on the GPUs within these data centers to deliver the load reduction that the grid needs, while doing least harm to those actual workloads and their throughput. A little more on our team. Our CEO, Varun, has been in the C-suite at a couple of publicly traded energy companies, Renew Power in India and Ørsted in Denmark. Professor Aisha Koshkun is our chief scientist. She's a professor at BU that's been doing research at this intersection of compute and power for over a decade, and a fantastic set of other colleagues here who bring a combination of AI experience, compute and computer science experience, and energy domain expertise. And we recently unstealthed in July and announced our $24 million seed capital raise, as well as the results of this demonstration that we'll talk about in a little bit. So really excited to kind of be out in the public talking with folks like yourselves about what we've been working on and the early partnerships we have in the industry, and the opportunity to really bring together these domains that maybe traditionally haven't talked to each other as much, the energy industry as well as the AI and compute industry. And as we go about our work, I think there's the headline sort of time to power aspect of what we've been pitching, right? But just this dynamic that has existed historically of limited engagement between compute and power is becoming evident to us. And so we're stumbling upon other opportunities to help address ways in which these industries could work better together that extend far beyond that sort of accelerate time to power value proposition. So that has us really excited. So Emerald AI sits at this intersection between signals, ingesting the signals from power markets, specifically through enrollment and demand response programs, as an example, coordinating in the middle of the slide, coordinating once we receive those signals with other hardware and software on-site data centers. And ultimately on the right side of the slide, our secret sauce, which is how we orchestrate compute workloads to then kind of feed back through this left, so starting left to right, but then going again right to left to deliver to the grid the load reduction that they're looking for. But to be clear, the focus here is on how we perform when those signals are received from the grid. But really what we're looking for is an appreciation of the reliability of that load reduction to be acknowledged upfront at the point of interconnection. And so that sort of speaks to some of the flexible interconnection programs that are in the works that Tyler was referring to. Our ultimate goal here is how can those interconnection processes across the country take into account load flexibility in a way that can be factored into interconnection and speed time to power. And then ultimately, the way that flexibility is expressed is through these demand response programs, hopefully sort of a new iteration of those. There's opportunities to rely somewhat on existing demand response programs, but plenty of opportunity to evolve those programs to be more friendly to data center participants, which were probably not the originally envisioned participants in a lot of these demand response programs. Our interventions of orchestrating workloads to deliver load shapes can live at various ends of this spectrum, down to the millisecond level, where folks in the AI world are now well familiar with the fact that GPUs, especially some of the latest, most power-intensive GPUs, can be incredibly spiky and swingy in terms of their power utilization, all the way up to the technically easier problem to solve, which is the hours length demand response type dispatch. We happen to believe that the hours length dispatch is actually the more valuable piece to speeding up interconnection. But we wanted to highlight that we kind of live on various ends of the spectrum. And you can imagine once a data center's interconnection is accelerated, thanks to trust in this sort of hours length dispatch and the fact that that will show up, these data centers can then actually deliver value to grids at various levels here and participate in frequency response or spinning reserve, so on and so forth. Can we go to the next slide? So before I get into the actual demonstration results, which are going to be more at that hours level, I wanted to show one of the demonstrations we did that was more at the second level, and how taking a cluster that is not participating in demand response, which has this incredibly volatile power profile, can actually follow a signal and deliver a much more predictable load. And so, I'm sure the folks on this call have a more of an energy slant than AI and compute slant. And I'm sure that has your minds turning on sort of the markets in which these data centers could participate. Okay. So we'll jump in now to the results of our commercial demonstration. So in early May, we went to a hyperscale data center in Phoenix, Arizona, with a set of stakeholders: Oracle, who owned this data center, Databricks as an AI customer who was running their workloads on the Oracle cloud infrastructure environment, NVIDIA, who actually is the manufacturer of the GPUs in that facility. And this is all under the auspices of the EPRI DC Flex initiative that folks here are probably aware of. And then involved APS and SRP as well as the utility stakeholders here, and essentially did this sort of joint optimization to say, on the one hand, APS and SRP, what do you need to see to believe that this data center would be a grid ally, not a grid foe, would actually deliver load reduction when it's needed the most on those extreme hours of the year, and that would give you the confidence to accelerate their interconnection. And so they gave us a set of specs independently, and so we ran 2 different demonstrations for each. And on the SRP side of things, sorry, if we could just stay on the previous slide for a second. On the SRP side of things, we were given instructions that we'd like to see a 25% load reduction with a 15-minute ramp in and 15-minute ramp out, and to hold that 25% load reduction over a period of 3 hours. On the other hand, we went to Databricks, the AI customer, and said, what is the flexibility tolerance of your workloads? And accordingly, where can we be respectful of that flexibility tolerance while delivering the load reduction needed here? Next slide, please. So the way this would work is we receive the demand response event trigger, and in this case, it was an hour ahead. Emerald simulator spun up into action, simulating the thousands or hundreds of thousands of scenarios, depending on the number of workloads you're dealing with at any given time. The various scenarios in terms of how we could approach orchestration to deliver the load reduction needed while doing least harm to the workloads. And then Emerald Conductor actually goes and orchestrates that result. And so if we go to the next slide, on the left-hand side here, you can see energy performance, and on the right side, compute performance. So the purple line is showing the SRP grid peaking on a May evening, and the teal line shows the cluster of 256 GPUs that has a roughly 100 kW of power utilization at steady state. And how once that 15-minute ramp-in period starts, the cluster reduces its power on an aggregate basis down to below the dashed black line, holds that level over 15 minutes, and ramps back up during the ramp out period, and returns kind of back to its original state without snapback. By the way, one of the interesting observations here is the checkpointing that you see, which is those little spikes downwards in the middle of the otherwise relatively steady graph. That's GPUs pausing to save their work and then resuming. And so you have this sudden drop in power utilization. This is one of those examples that I was alluding to earlier of the ways in which compute has sort of developed without regard for power. And it's not very difficult actually to take these coincident checkpoints and actually schedule them a little more thoughtfully, not so as not to cause this kind of spiky power profile. So that's just one of the many ways in which compute and power maybe traditionally haven't talked to each other, and there's a ton of opportunity for optimization. So the utilities were sort of satisfied with this result in terms of the load reduction. On the right-hand side, you can see what harm we did to the workloads to deliver that load reduction. And you can see that in every flexibility bucket, Flex 3, Flex 2, and Flex 1, Flex 3 being your most flexible jobs and Flex 1 being your least flexible jobs, each of those buckets had a performance threshold they needed to meet, about 50%, 75%, and 90% respectively. And in each case, we were able to deliver this load reduction while keeping the workload throughput well in excess of the thresholds required by the AI customer. And overall here, actually, if we could stay on that slide for a second, there's an interesting insight here, and it builds a bit on what Tyler was saying earlier, where we delivered a 25% load reduction, but on a weighted average basis, the workload throughput reduction was far less than a 25% degradation, right? It's somewhere in the ballpark of like a 10% aggregate degradation. If you see the red bar at the end there, which is taking everything all together. This speaks a little bit to that insight that the sort of that there are nines of requirement is not entirely accurate, right? And that actually running GPUs at that full throttle has diminishing returns. And so you can get quite a bit of load reduction with elegant workload orchestration that does not require the same percentage of workload throughput degradation. You can go to the next slide. Just really don't need to go into immense detail here, but just to drive home the point that the load shape that you see on the left side is really an aggregation of a bunch of different strategies employed on the array of workloads at that moment. No individual GPU is necessarily delivering that exact shape, but on a composite basis, combination of employing the various strategies we're employing, like pausing and resuming jobs intelligently, power capping jobs intelligently, geo-shifting jobs, so on and so forth, we're able to deliver this kind of composite performance. I think something that this audience would be uniquely interested in is around how tightly the actuals match the forecast. So the simulator power, this red line is the particular approach we wanted to take. And now we've switched to the, I think, APS load profile. That was the red line that we chose in terms of what simulation we liked the most of doing least harm to the workloads. And the blue line is then what we actually delivered in terms of power profile once we orchestrated. And so this is what we're trying to kind of harp on in terms of the reliability of this technology, which hopefully will go a ways in delivering comfort to authorities interconnecting assets, right? Transmission grid operators, to believe that this sort of form of load reduction is reliable and therefore can be used as a basis for accelerating interconnection. And we had EPRI throw us a slightly more complicated problem as well, while we had access to those GPUs, and said, you know, what would be a more interesting load profile to deliver on? And so we talked about this event in NASEO that some of you may remember in 2020, where you had a 500 megawatt power plant trip offline at around 3 p.m. and then at around 6 p.m. a set of rolling outages once the system hit its net peak. And so we were able to simulate that as well, as you can see with the blue line. So there's really an immense range of kind of load profiles we can deliver with this. Truly, the sky's the limit. So I want to acknowledge that this is a very high level slide. We don't want to kind of present ourselves like sort of academic experts in this realm, right? I think Tyler has a lot of sophisticated ideas that he presented around how this sort of sector can be catalyzed. From our perspective as a private sector entity, it's clear to us that there's a lot of opportunity for energy sector and AI sector to come together. On the energy side, obviously, we're looking for more accelerated interconnection processes, non-firm processes that take into account the unique kind of attributes of data centers. Some ideas here are around the idea that to the extent we can avoid binary 100% curtailment type approaches that kind of scare away data centers, frankly, how can we use more nuanced, intelligent approaches that allow for the delivery of load reduction while data centers are allowed to still maintain their most important workloads and not actually have to kind of flip a switch and go 0 versus 1 in terms of completely turning off the facility. So we're seeing these interesting interconnection kind of non-firm or flexible interconnection pilots and programs being stood up across the country, and we applaud those. But what we would ask is, are there ways we can make these more and more nuanced in terms of appreciating the opportunity to do virtual curtailment and be respectful of the workloads running on those facilities. Designing new approaches to study large flexible loads. I mean, that kind of goes into the interconnection processes. How can these interconnection studies factor in load reduction? And ultimately, I'm cognizant that a lot of the attendees here are state energy offices, right? What kinds of pilots and programs and funding for those programs can this audience support to develop more comfort for utilities and ISO RTOs in terms of the reliability of this kind of load reduction? On the AI side, the ways we're working with the AI sector on this are around PowerFlex SLAs. In other words, SLAs that cloud service providers would have with their underlying AI customers who are renting GPU capacity from them that provide a 2-tier level of service. That is to say, imagine an Oracle, which is a cloud service provider, going to their AI customers saying, hey, if you want 5 nines of performance with 0 chance of downtime, 24/7, 365, no problem, but you might have to wait a little longer for access. Your access might be a little more expensive. On the flip side, if you're willing to tolerate a really modest amount of flexibility, we can get you cheaper access, faster access, more flexible access. Cloud service providers already have versions of this today. They've got spot instances, as they call them, and those spot instances currently are a fairly poor customer experience. Now, they're very cheap as well, but the deal there is that effectively is if the cloud service provider needs access to your GPUs, they can just grab them from you and you lose all your progress and there's really no notice given. And so it's sort of a brute force approach to PowerFlex. And we think there's a big opportunity to take that and make it more sophisticated and in doing so, make it a more monetizable tier for cloud service providers. I think that I'll pause there. So thank you for the time. Thank you for the opportunity for us to share what we're working on here at Emerald AI. I hope that didn't come off like an advertisement for us. Like, I think overall, we're one of many folks working on demand flexibility and see ourselves as a complement to a variety of other tools, and certainly keen to partner with folks on the energy side, on the AI side, in the enabling ecosystem side, right? Other folks that are working on demand flexibility where our technology can be co-optimized with theirs. So I'll stop there. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much, Arun. That was absolutely fascinating as well. And really, really cool to see just the work that you're doing in this space, but especially in Phoenix. So really appreciate you doing this in Arizona, especially given how much work we have here in Arizona. So really, again, appreciate your findings and being able to share that with the group. So I just wanted to remind everyone, we do have the Q&A function, so please do and continue to drop in your questions there. And while you add those questions into the Q&A function, we'll move into a moderated discussion portion here with both Tyler and Arun. So to start off with, And this one actually goes to Emerald AI first. So obviously, we know that there are different types of data centers by function and size and capacity and business models. For example, hyperscaler owners and operators, edge data centers, managed data centers offering leases or services on a lease basis. Can you tell us a little bit more about how your results translate or can apply to those specific types? And then, if at all, do the lessons from your research on data center computing load flexibility translate to flexibility and grid integration of other large power loads?
Sure, yeah. So I think from there's a technical complexity piece and a business model complexity piece. I think from a technical complexity perspective, there is not, or rather, it translates quite well, right? There's not some sort of meaningful difference that causes our result to not be as relevant. Right, the classic distinction we run into would be your sort of co-location data center, where you have a data center developer like Quinix is a classic example, or Crusoe even, who's developed a data center, developed the facility, gotten the power, developed the on-site sort of environment, cooling, et cetera. And then really the GPUs are brought by a cloud service provider. And that can be in a little bit of contrast to a model that is followed usually more by like the Metas and Googles of the world, where it's all build it yourself. In both of these environments, you're talking about a cloud service layer that is typically orchestrating the workloads. And so the technical feasibility is very much the same. Things change a little bit as you move into non-cloud and non-AI focused environments. And to be clear, we're talking here, we're putting a lot of attention and a lot of oxygen in the room is being taken up by sort of this AI conversation. To be clear, it will still be several years before AI-based data center compute exceeds non-AI data centers. Like the existing incumbent installed base of data centers is still heavily CPU focused, non-AI focused. And so we think there's tremendous opportunity there. The technical specifics of how we would go about orchestrating workloads for those kinds of, call it enterprise data centers, non-AI focused data centers, changes a little bit, but that's I think that's more in the weeds. I think at a concept level lends itself quite well. On a business model perspective though, Blaze, I'd say certainly adding more stakeholders to the equation increases complexity. So for example, on time to power, in a co-location situation, you might need, or you do need deep involvement from both that data center developer, who is the principal agent involved in securing that access to power, but you also need the kind of buy-in of that eventual cloud service tenant, like an Oracle or GCP or Azure, who needs to be signed on to the value proposition of this flexibility they're committing to earn that accelerated power. So hopefully that answers your question.
No, yeah, definitely. Thank you. I appreciate that. So I know that we have a few questions in the Q&A function about this as well. But we'll start with Tyler on this one. So what questions should state officials ask data center developers before development?
Yeah, thanks for that. Probably won't try to cover all the questions because I think they could range pretty widely, but sort of within theme here. I mean, if we didn't have existing construct around duty to serve and socialization of a substantial portion of the cost of service, then, at least in my view, there might be fewer implications for the ratepayers and the regulators and the ratepayer advocates that are, representing their interests. But to the extent that ratepayers are likely going to be on the hook for some portion of costs, and by the way, very important to think about very holistically, right? Are all costs being accounted for here, from generation, reserve margin, transmission, distribution, and other potential sort of ancillary costs. But if the ratepayers are going to be on the hook to some extent, or even if there are trade-offs, right, and prioritizing upgrades, right, we have just limited resources to pursue network upgrades. So if we're prioritizing those limited resources to serve these new loads as compared to maybe pursuing other upgrades that might have other benefits for the ratepayers, right? If that's the case, then it does seem to me that the regulators may want to understand what the possibility might be to avoid putting more stress on periods of system stress, right, to mitigate those costs that the ratepayers may be assigned, or again, that there may be trade-offs around in terms of prioritizing. And so I think this theme that I highlighted around really understanding. So when we say, a gigawatt of new data center load is coming in, what does that actually look like from a capacity utilization standpoint? What do we think that's going to translate to in terms of megawatt hours over the course of the year? But also, what do we think the peak coincidence will actually look like? And look, we understand it's hard to predict. It can be hard to predict when this is a new market and you're not entirely sure what the demand will be for services and different types of workloads. But to the extent that there is any ability to plan around some degree of flexibility during those periods of highest system stress, then that could benefit the ratepayers. And whether that's through a capability like Emerald AI's, whether that's, again, the example of where your loss of load expectation is highly concentrated in that 3-hour period during polar vortexes, right? Could we expect that their cooling loads will be a bit low? Can we plan around that, right, so that we can mitigate costs, especially in an environment where rates are already rising? So there are a lot of other things I would, certainly advise asking, but I do think that this theme of understanding what the capacity utilization rate is, understanding what the peak coincidence will be, and understanding what, if any, possibility there would be for flex. And then last thing I'll just add on that is using all of that to hopefully inform additional service tiers, right, for those large loads that are able and willing to provide some flexibility to the system. Because I think a theme that we've seen emerge in some jurisdictions, including PJM and SPP, is that first off, we've never really planned the system for flexible loads. I mean, they may decide to participate in demand response once they're online, but we've rarely planned for flexibility up front in terms of resource adequacy, accounting, and transmission and interconnection studies. And so we do need a different approach to planning, and that may mean that we need new transmission and or interconnection service tiers. And it gets a little complex as you have these kind of, if it's ISO-RTO versus the LSE and sort of how do they interact. We're actually working with Allison Clements and others to sort of better characterize some of those regulatory and service tier dynamics, because it actually is pretty complicated. And actually, I think these are questions that have never fully been grappled with to some extent because of the jurisdictional split between federal and state on serving load. But yeah, those are some of the questions I think that are worth asking.
Thank you. Arun, anything to add to that?
Just looking at some of the great other questions coming in, so happy to jump to other questions.
Yeah, no, that sounds good. Let's do one more question that I have, because I know that there's a question about this in the Q&A as well. And I do think that it is really good to hit on, and would love either of you to start off with this one. But what are some policy recommendations and or other regulatory recommendations for advancing demand flexibility for large loads that you would recommend?
I'm happy to do a couple of quick ones. Again, I don't want to present ourselves like policy experts. We're obviously a private sector entity, but as we go about our work, I think two things have come out that would assist beyond the obvious. I've sort of stated the obvious, and Tyler has too, around incorporating this into planning, right? As opposed to sort of how DR is treated for thermostats, as an example, as a sort of fun tool that may or may not show up, right? That's not what we want for this. A key value proposition here is clearing out interconnection queues by incentivizing flexibility in the planning. But sort of beyond that, I think one of the pieces is that we look at increasingly data centers are not just what we used to think of them as, right? They're full cities behind a meter, right? They're in many cases doubling the size of the load served previously by a given sublab or what have you. And so one of the concepts that we've been pushing out there a little bit is sub-metering, and the opportunity to sort of allow for some of that demand flexibility to be expressed without requiring coordination of every entity behind that meter, right? That is you will get much less flexibility out of the system if you're requiring everyone behind that master meter to be coordinated. Whereas if you can allow some level of settlement at sub-meters, we could actually accelerate participation in these programs quite a bit. The other one is something I touched on earlier, so I'll just quickly reference it again, is like avoiding 0 versus 1 binary approaches to curtailment, right? Opportunities that allow, and it seemed like the PJM co-location docket has some amount of this in it, so we're excited about that, but sort of opportunities that create a path for a data center to self-curtail in ways that are most intelligent to minimize harm to their own workloads, rather than sort of brute force power capping over the top approaches. So that's all I'd add to that.
And Tyler, is there any others that you would want to highlight?
Yeah, thanks for that. I feel like, already touched on the introduction of sort of flexible service tiers where that may be valuable, and that could be entirely voluntary, right? There's the whole question of if and when any sort of mandate might be appropriate, but at minimum, making the option available so that a flexible or co-located load or data center with Emerald's capabilities could use it, right? So that, and in particular, so that capitalize on accelerated speed to power, because under existing interconnection processes, there's may not be like a fast lane because you happen to be a flexible load. So at minimum, I think creating those service tiers. I do think it's worth noting so there's this whole realm of protecting ratepayers against stranded assets, and I think that's getting pretty well established at this point. We've seen enough, so I feel like there are a lot of good reports that have characterized that, and it seems like we're making headway. I do think that this realm of sort of emergency load shedding is probably going to become tricky. And in the case of Texas, I think it's worth recognizing. So why did they enact SB6? A number of reasons, but one, at least from the stakeholders I've heard that participated, is that during Winter Storm Uri, they had a situation where entire residential neighborhoods were cut off while large industrial loads just a few miles away were left untouched. And I think there was a motivation to not relive that experience and to ensure that loads where, if there's load shedding, have minimal impact in terms of potential loss of life on site should be prioritized for load shedding above loads where there could be a direct impact of that nature. And so that's the direction they're headed in. It's a tricky topic to talk about, load shedding prioritization. But it does seem to me that it's going to come up because there will inevitably be, God forbid, but there will inevitably be some, load shedding event that occurs in a given jurisdiction that has a data center. And I think it could be tricky if you have the data center sort of untouched and other customers that are experiencing significant impact. So perhaps considering from an absolute minimum standard, what does that look like for emergency situations, even if you're not ready to tackle, the broader load flexibility conversation?
No, thank you. There are some questions now coming in, so we'll start going through some of the participant Q&As questions. So first one, Arun, this one's for you. There was a question around reminding the participants what the flex tiers are.
So the flex tiers in the demonstration were just a particular choice of how we wanted to design flexibility, kind of accounting for different flexibility tolerances of different workload types. So it's nothing sort of generalizable. It's just like in that particular demonstration, we chose to categorize different workload types into those 3 buckets and chose a different flexibility tolerance for each of those buckets. Frankly, I think that's more for demonstration purposes. As we go forward, the way we are doing this at commercial scale is not that sort of simplistic and more reflective of the deeper granularity of flexibility tolerance of every underlying workload type.
Thank you. So it seems that we have several questions on how quickly data centers can respond. So can we talk a little bit more, and maybe we'll go to Arun first and then Tyler, a little bit more about how quickly data centers can actually flex and respond to real-time operational needs and localized needs. So let's start with Arun on that one and then to Tyler.
Yeah, it's obviously early days, right? But we've been able to demonstrate that we can get GPUs to respond within milliseconds. Now, that's not necessarily directly answering your question, because really what we also care about is what's happening at the master meter. And so far we have confidence that we can deliver load reduction in a matter of seconds at the overall site meter. But that's just because of some of the latency between what we're doing at the GPU level and what happens at the site meter.
And Tyler, anything to add to that?
Yeah, I just want to first reflect on how remarkable that is. Right, you compare that to sort of traditional demand response, where you're usually talking for at least like sort of bulk resource adequacy provision. You're talking about multi-hour notices. I mean, direct phone calls oftentimes, from the operator to large industrial loads. So we're entering a whole new world here, right? Being able to send more real-time control signals, and to these purely digital loads, right? They're just much more controllable than many other types of loads, which is why I think there is so much interest in exploring this flexibility theme, just because these are so much more controllable and precision controllable. I also think, though, it is worth noting that you don't need to have, and I think Arun touched on this a little bit earlier, but you don't need to have a second scale, or let alone a millisecond scale response, to be able to tap these resources for the purposes of resource adequacy. And that's in part because our forecasting is just getting better and better. And that's also, by the way, one of the great benefits of AI, is it is improving all of our load forecasting, our weather forecasting. And so I think it's helpful to start from, as I was saying, like the emergency service is sort of like the square one. And if you're thinking about this, where you are able to forecast an extreme weather system, you might even see it coming, a week in advance, possibly even more in the case of large polar vortex systems. But certainly within, a day out, you're going to have a sense of whether you need to call upon or have the ability to call on those resources. And so in the case of SB6, I think they're talking about in the realm of giving actually like a whole day's notice. But certainly hours long time scale, that's the general expectation of when you can have, a demand response capability. So I guess to sum that up, the capability for fast response is far beyond, I think, what is needed to get the most bang for the buck in terms of that resource adequacy provision.
Thank you. And I know this next question, I've actually had this conversation with Governor Hobbs here in Arizona, and it is very much a concern of hers, and wanting to make sure that we're talking about protecting ratepayers. So want a little bit more conversation, and maybe we'll start with Tyler on this one, then go to Arun. But Tyler, could you talk a little bit more about either policy examples or things that we can do to protect ratepayers?
Yeah. Well, that first theme probably is protecting them from the stranded asset risk, right? And again, that's where I think we've seen a lot of the momentum on the tariffs, is just ensuring that there is upfront security that's posted in case that data center doesn't materialize, or it doesn't materialize at anywhere near the scale that it initially expected. And it seems like the data center is largely aligned on those visions. I'm sure there's particulars always under debate. But that seems like the absolute minimum. But beyond that, in terms of actually putting downward pressure on rate increases, in my mind, it's this fascinating paradox where, on one hand, we know that the inflexible data center growth that's already happening is going to contribute to rate increases, and we're already seeing that play out. We should also not attribute it where it's not accurate. I think there's been some claims floating around that like all these existing rate increases that we're seeing around the country are caused by it, but it actually hasn't shown up in rates yet, right? In retail rates for the latest wave of the AI data centers. But in PJM, right, the PJM Independent Market Monitor, they put out a report a little over a month ago concluding that data centers were the primary driver of the increase in the capacity market clearing price. That's certainly a debatable point, but that is what they concluded. And so it is going to be a significant driver. There's more to come. But the flip side is that if we're able to accommodate them such that it doesn't trigger such a large need for bulk infrastructure expansion, then we could actually spread the existing fixed costs of the system across more kilowatt hours in a way that could be a major offset to rate spikes that are also going to be driven from other sources. So it's sort of, on one hand, these could be a major contributor to what are some are calling the affordability crisis, but on the other hand, it could actually be one of the biggest offsets if we can plan and integrate them in a more intelligent way. And I think when you look at the characterization of Google's flexibility contracts that were announced on Monday, both Google and the utility, and especially in Indiana Michigan Power, characterized one of the key benefits as cost savings and affordability. And to be fair, we don't have the details of the contract. We don't know exactly, how much of that is going to offset. So hopefully there'll be more to come on that. But I think it's helpful to sort of reframe this as this is an opportunity to actually offset rate spikes, but to the extent that we can plan and integrate them more intelligently.
Just quickly on that, obviously more utilization out of existing infrastructure helps affordability. And in addition to mitigating this sort of stranded asset problem, right? I think folks in this room are some of our best allies, right? Who have those direct connections to the commissions and the governor, who care about affordability, and sort of also positioning your states as sort of destinations for AI data centers to come site themselves, right? Kind of love to see the competitive juices flowing, right, in this industry that otherwise can be a little bit of a natural monopoly type industry, right? So yeah, because no secret, right? Utilities would love to rate-based stuff, and so where can we find opportunities to not have that framework of always and forever building towards firm service, assuming this load is going to be pulling at its max rated capacity 24/7, 365. I think as long as we're solely chasing that paradigm, we will struggle to fight affordability.
And maybe I'll just add a very back of the envelope figure here. I was just curious how much contribution data center load could contribute to the existing fixed costs of the system. And again, this is very rough, but just to give us a sense of scale. So if we take the upper end forecast that you saw earlier from Lawrence Berkeley Lab for 2028, they said 580 terawatt hours of data center load in the US would be that upper end number. And I dug into some EIA data, and I came to the conclusion very roughly that approximately 1/3 of retail bills on average are for actual energy generation, whereas 2/3 are fixed costs, which include the cost of the power plants and transmission, distribution, overhead, everything else. Again, that varies a lot from jurisdiction to jurisdiction, so don't come at me if yours is different. And then if we take the current average retail rate of electricity of 13.2 cents, where it is now, that'll rise. So that would generate in 2028, assuming no increase in average retail rates, $51 billion from that data center load that could be used towards the covering the existing fixed costs of the system. So the scale here is enormous, and it's very exciting, but there's also a lot that has to be done to make sure that that is an opportunity.
Thank you. And I think, unfortunately, this will probably be our last question before I pass it back over to NASEO. I think we'll probably start with Arun and then see if Tyler has anything to add to this one. So can existing data centers be retrofitted to work with Emerald AI or similar compute flexibilities? And are there special hardware telemetry needs for that? Oh, you're on mute.
Apologies, had to do it once, right? Yeah, absolutely. We're a software only solution, and so they absolutely can be. And the sort of telemetry requirements are more about Emerald connecting with existing telemetry that's usually on site. obviously there's sort of the question of what demand response program the facility wants to is participating in, and the telemetry requirements of that particular program and utility or ISO RTO.
Thank you. And Tyler, anything else you want to add to that?
Apologies. No, I think that's okay. I mean, I think when we start talking about highly distributed loads and virtual power plants, we're talking about thousands and thousands of small customers, the telemetry dynamic becomes that much more complex and solvable. But in this case, we're talking about some of the largest single point loads that have ever been on the power system, and they obviously have extremely sophisticated tool sets and technologies and telemetry capabilities. So I'm much less concerned about that aspect of this than I am just about getting the basic sort of regulatory mechanisms in place and the willingness from the data center owner operators.
Well, thank you both so much for your thoughts, for sharing your presentations. Really, honestly, absolutely fascinating conversation. I know there are so many other questions that we didn't get to. So clearly, this is quite an interesting topic for everyone here today. So just want to, again, express our appreciation for your presentations and time. And I will pass this back over to NASEO.
Very
Thank you.
happy to be responsive to questions we didn't get to offline.
Great, great. Thank you all. Camille, could you put up the next slide? We have a slide with some upcoming NASEO events, I believe. So many thanks to Tyler, Arun, and Blaise for an excellent discussion. There are quite a few more questions in the chat, and I'm sure there are many, many questions generally. I'm sure this will continue to advance on these topics. Also, I want to thank Camille Norton and Jasmine Shia, my NASEO colleagues, for helping put this together and run this webinar and making it work. We have a slide up with some upcoming events, but in lieu of reading any of them, I'm going to invite our colleague and friend Jeff Loiter from NARUC if he wants to offer a few words.
Thanks, Rod. Sorry I couldn't greet you all at the beginning. Just very quickly, this is absolutely a topic of great interest to NARUC and of great interest to our group, the Center for Partnerships and Innovation. We will be continuing to work on this. It's also been part of our NARUC leadership's focus for this year. President Pridemore has had 2 demand roundtables at our big conferences, and there'll be a 3rd one in November. So we will be continuing to work on this. We don't have any specific future items lined up now, but we are in the planning process. So if you have thoughts about resources or discussions that would be relevant or of interest to you, please let us know. We want to keep the focus on this. We know there's a lot of interest, as evidenced by the fantastic discussion and many, many questions. Thanks, Rod.
Thanks, Jeff. And we're always grateful for our collaboration with NARUC. It's been very fruitful and very enjoyable as well. Well, thank you all for joining us today. Again, this is a conversation that will no doubt continue as things advance. And have a good rest of the day, good rest of the week. And we look forward to you joining us as well as our NARUC friends and colleagues at future events. So take care, everyone, and thanks again.